you're in an academic setting, college environment, let me take a moment to the issue that Matt referred to, religion has been politicized, and remind yourself that religion always has provided to the rulers, or religion has been used by rulers to provide legitimacy to their rule, and so religion gets politicized. And once religion gets politicized, it's no more religion, it's a political theology. And the whole effort to separate and understand religion in its essence is some sort of what it is pure message is lost and cannot be picked up because it is seen through the lenses of politics all the time. So the question, is Islam a religion of peace, or is Islam whatever the opposite would be? Religion of war, I suppose, peace and war. I mean, Tolstoy, War and Peace. No, the question or the answer would be there are Muslims who are peaceful people, and there are Muslims who are seized by a political theology in our time that we're talking about through the 20th century, last part of the 20th century, and into our time, who are seized by a political ideology and have become the foot soldiers of that political ideology that is vicious, that is warlike, that is driven by an animus of hatred towards the other. And we should be able to distinguish all of that and understand it. The reason we need to distinguish that is because we, right here in this city, in this university, in the West, in Canada, we need to understand it in a global sense, even though the heartland of the United States was attacked on 9/11, 3,000 people died, World Trade Center was brought down. We need to understand that the Arab Muslim world is a world basically living on $2 a day per annum. This is not a part of the world like the Soviet Union was, that was a second mightiest military power and its economy threatened and its science threatened, and the West dealt with it for almost 50 years through a strategy of Cold War and contained it. If the West wants, and that is where we are missing of our understanding, the very early point that I think Matt was making, who are we? What is it we stand for? If the West was really threatened by the Arab Muslim world, we could put into place a policy of containment. I have written about this and I have argued that we should be putting a policy of containment as a policy option, put it on the table. The reality is that the Arab Muslim world is no threat to the West. The reality is the Arab Muslim world is a threat to itself. At the end of the day, a very advanced culture and civilization that was Germany was seized by a political ideology that led to a Gotterdammerung. The maximum number of people who suffered and died as a result were Germans themselves. I won't get into all the other ancillary facts, but that was the reality. Hitler went down in flames and Germany went down in flames. And that is a situation which is what the Muslim world is faced with. It is a totally grotesque internal failure of the Arab Muslim world. The parallel, comparative, political entity and culture that is adjacent to the Arab Muslim world, to take it as an example, which also has a per capita income of roughly, $2-3 per day per capita income, is India, which is the second largest country in terms of world population, but is the world's largest functioning democracy. It is making all the effort to be a liberal democratic society with all the problems and faults. It is moving in that direction over the last 60 years. It is not the Arab Muslim world have to look to Canada for any lesson, or United States, or Europe. You should turn around and look to India. India is not in a state of grievance and resentment and self-destruction, though there are many Indians who are in a state of many different state of minds, like any other society. But as a political entity, India is a demonstration of highly diverse, ethnic, linguistically, religiously, all the religions of the world is present. India is the second largest Muslim country in the world. And India's development is a significant reality of the second half of the 20th century and now the 21st century, that people are looking toward that part of the world and see India as a major power that is going to be present in the 21st century, as a major trading power with Canada, with Europe, with the United States. And so there's a lesson. And there is Pakistan that was cut off from the same fabric as is India. And Pakistan is a totally grotesque failure in every sense of the term. In politics, in culture, in economic, the living standard, the security of the people, the number of people that have been killed and have been killed. In 1971, Pakistan broke apart through a genocide. 1 million people were killed, or 10 million people were refugees. And that's exactly what's happening in the Arab Muslim world. So we need to put it in perspective. There's one very immediate and great concern about the relationship in the Middle East between the Arab states, the consequences of the Arab Spring, with the imminent rise and taking power of these totalitarian political ideology in Egypt. We've seen what's happening in Syria. We've seen what happened in Libya. We've seen the terrible bloodletting that has gone on in Iraq. And that being played out in some way with the State of Israel, the only democracy in that part of the world. And the State of Israel is a daily reminder to these people, there's 250 million Arabs and Iranians in that region, what a grotesque failure these cultures are. Even as they talk about the great civilization, they can't feed their people. They cannot even produce one instrument, like a needle, that can be exported. The only export that Iran has is 80% of its export is petroleum and petroleum products. The rest is pistachio and carpets. This is the 21st century. So Israel, in that sense, is a terrible reminder to these people, that is to the political leaders, of how great their failure is, and therefore the deflection from their own failure to trying to pinpoint and blame the other, or in the case of Pakistan, the inability to deal with the reality of India and engage India or try to disrupt India with terrorist attack, whether it's from Kashmir or what happened in Mumbai, disrupt the life. That the consequence of that, the consequence, if there had been a successful bombing, there may be an attempt from Pakistani supported terrorists made the attempt just after 9/11 to bomb the Indian Parliament. If the Indian Parliament had been bombed with the session in place, and a bloodbath had taken place of political leaders, the consequences would have been terrible. But immediately the consequences would have been paid by the Muslims of India. And that's exactly what they want to precipitate. They want to precipitate a clash, a crisis between Muslim and others, and then demonstrate how the others are out to make the lives of Muslims miserable, which is a self-fulfilling argument. So we are in a situation driven by this group of people, and they are not very large, but they have taken power. They intimidate, they kill. The governor of the province of Punjab in Pakistan is like the province of Canada, Ontario, the largest province in Pakistan, with a population close to 80 million people. So the governor of the province is the #1 executive administrator, the executive branch. He was killed by his own security agent, his bodyguard, last year. Why? Because this man was making all the effort to try to amend some aspects of Pakistan's political life to bring about a relationship between the Pakistani, which is an Islamic country or a Muslim country, with this minority population, the Christian in this instance. And for that, he was shot to death by his own security detail. That's how terrible and absurd the situation is. Benazir Bhutto, killed by people surrounding her, the hands of ISI, the military intelligence, is all over the map on this issue. Nobody that talks with any degree of reason and rationality is safe. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the murder of Sadat by the very people whose political party is now coming to power in Egypt. Sadat was the leader of the largest Arab country in the world. Sadat went to Jerusalem. Sadat embraced the Israelis. Sadat made peace. Israel withdrew. The only Arab country that made peace with Israel, the largest Arab country, for which Sadat was killed. Sadat spoke in the name of Islam. His inspiration was on the basis of Islam. If anybody is interested and serious, you can go and look at the speech Sadat gave in the Knesset. It is a glorious speech with the glorious references of the relationship between the two people of the Abrahamic religion. But who killed him? The totalitarian force. Now the danger to the West is precisely when the West cannot distinguish between a totalitarian ideology in the garment of a religion and a people who are peaceful. The ideology in the garment of the religion has penetrated our society. It speaks from our mosques, and our political leaders cannot distinguish that and therefore cannot separate and deal with these people. These people have to be dealt with. They are the virus, the bacteria. They are 7%, as we're talking about after the July bombing in the United Kingdom and the various polling data that shows in Canada that, the Muslim population, again, a very diverse ethnic Muslim population in Canada, is somewhere around about 800,000. And if 7% of that population, you do the arithmetic, 7% of that population are the willing foot soldiers, like the 18 who were arrested in Toronto, the foot soldier of this totalitarian ideology, then that 7% is a very large number. It might be very small in terms of the overall number as percentage, but in terms of the numbers of who can do damage. So if there is 7% or 10%, or take an upper limit, 15% of the Muslim population worldwide are seen by this totalitarian ideology in a population of nearly 2 billion people, then we are talking about 200 million people, isn't it? They can intimidate and silence people, and that's what they have done. And if I may have a minute, do I have a minute? Okay, 1 minute. I won't take too much time. You can cut back my time to the other question. It is the people from the Muslim world, the Muslim country, they know what they are faced with and dealing with. After Iraq was liberated in 2003, some 3 months later, the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini came to Najaf in Iraq. Najaf is the holiest city for the Shiites in Iraq. This grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iraq, to Najaf, and there he spoke up. And he spoke up, and I don't know why, but I put it up from my file, the first sheet of an interview we gave. In New York Times reported it, and this is from 2003, August 6th. Neil Farquhar of New York Times engaged in an interview with the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini. His name is Hossein Khomeini, young man who was possibly in his late 30s at that time. And this is what he said about many things he said, and I'll just read it to you, and you can deduct my minute. Iranians insist on freedom, but they are not sure where it will come from, said Mr. Khomeini. He's 45 years old, so I was quite right. If it comes from inside Iran, he said, if it comes from inside, the people of Iran will welcome it. But if it is necessary for it to come from abroad, especially from the United States, people will accept it. I, as an Iranian, will accept it. Now you've got to sit and think and pause. Who is speaking? This is not some Tom, Dick, and Harry. This is the Ayatollah's grandson, who is himself going to be an Ayatollah. And he's saying, I would welcome the United States to free us Iranians from what? From the totalitarian ideology that his grandfather imposed on the Iranians. That's where we are in the Arab Muslim. That's the struggle. The West doesn't understand it. The West wants to, in fact, make apologies and appeasing the very forces that are destroying that part of the world.
Thank you, Dr. First question will start with Dr. Mansur. What is the appropriate response to the threat of Islamic totalitarianism? Is peace possible between their values and Western values? And if so, how do we achieve it? What is the appropriate response to the threat of Islamic totalitarianism? Is peace possible between their values and Western values? And if so, how do we achieve it?
Well, again, in 3 minutes, the most important response I would say for 3 minutes is that we, in the West, and again, I'm speaking here as a Canadian, and hopefully our Prime Minister earlier on did identify that Islamicism, the choice of the word may be the problem, I mean, Islamism or Islamicism, whatever the word that the Prime Minister used, but the intent of it was absolutely correct. But here was the Prime Minister of a G8 country, a Commonwealth country, one of the most important countries in the world today, and has been for a long time. We have a very proud history, of standing for and defending freedom. We went to war, both in World War I and World War II, in the Korean War. We were there, negotiating peace with the Arabs and Israelis in 1956 at Suez. Our men and women wearing the UN blue beret have been all over the world. For what? As they are right now in Afghanistan. To defend freedom. To defend individual rights, which is our value as a liberal democracy. And our Prime Minister spoke out and said Islamism is the biggest threat. And I agree with our Prime Minister. Our response should be, we should be talking loudly and clearly in every international forum. At the United Nations, at the UNESCO, and wherever our members of our government, our politicians, they travel abroad, to speak about that Islamism is the virus and the greatest threat to the freedom of the people who needs it the most. If this part of the world is going to develop, if this part of the world is going to enter the 19th century, forget about the 21st century, it needs to roll back Islamism. We don't need to be taught by any people, and the last person on earth are those mullahs in Iran or in any of the Arab Muslim countries about human decency, about respect for individual rights, about respect for freedom of conscience, about respect for religion. We don't need any lesson from these people. But we should be pointing out and standing up and pushing back so that the tremendous threat that we are faced with today, that there is 56 countries, Muslim majority countries, they call themselves Islamic State, who are members of this organization called Organization for Islamic Conference. And again, those of you who understand politics as students and you study an international organization, when you have numbers, you can push through agenda. And so in the United Nations, with 56 members, the OIC, they have the numbers to push through agenda. And one of the most vicious, pernicious agenda that they have been pushing over the last many years, and now it has reached a point that they might succeed, is to get the United Nations to adopt a resolution that will make it criminal to speak about religion. Of course, the only religion that they are interested in is their political ideology, not Islam. Because nobody is abusing Islam. It is their political ideology, Islamism. But see, they take the garment of religion to protect their political ideology. So they are pushing on Saudi Arabia, for instance, Iran, for instance, Pakistan, the Taliban. So they're pushing this agenda that the UN adopt the defamation of religion clause. And if the UN adopts it, and we then as signatories, as member states of the UN, would be then in a position that our ability to speak and stand up and discuss these matters will then go against the UN principle, the UN statute, the UN resolution. Now this is one of the major threats I believe we are faced with. We're not faced with what Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Afghanistan can threaten the West. These countries will be vaporized. Iran too will be vaporized, by the way, when Obama's speech on, I don't trust Obama, but what he said the other day at APAC, he basically said that Iran is in the immediate threshold of going beyond the requirement to raise the uranium enrichment to acquiring a nuclear weapon. Then not only Israel, but the United States hold the right to take out the Iranian weapon. He did not go that we'll take it out right now, so that's another debate, but he's already signaled that. Iran will be vaporized. So it's not that they can militarily threaten us, but it is our culture, it is our value, it is the value of a free society that is under great threat. And it's not under threat by some ayatollahs in Iran, it is under threat by our own political leaders who are bending backward on the basis of a fallacious argument of political correctness, of multiculturalism, cultural relativism, to abandon the fundamental values which made the West what the West is, but not only the West, the arguments of the West are not universal arguments. The argument of freedom of speech is not for the freedom of speech of a white man, or a white woman, or a Christian, or a Canadian. It is a universal argument. And that's the threat that we are facing with the rise of the virus that is spreading in the Arab Muslim country of Islamism. Thank you.
I think we have the two questions, in this section of the panel are: is peace possible? Well, yes, of course it is. War is also possible. I think we need to be ready for both. But peace would almost be easier. It would only really require disengagement. And when it comes to what should be done, in large measure, I would say what we should do is disengage abroad and build our own strength at home. Last year, actually almost exactly a year ago, when we decided to get into it in Libya, just from the perspective of my editorial board, we did not think that was a good idea. We didn't necessarily see any particular advantage to that, and we haven't actually sat down and hammered out a position yet on Syria, but our position, I would imagine, would be similar. It's not something we necessarily want to get involved in, but we can defend ourselves if necessary, and I think Salim has made the point that the West, despite its current many problems, faces no real military threat. And I would therefore have to agree with him again. I would never accuse Salim of theft. I think he might have borrowed some of my thunder. Because I think the problem we face is one of relativism. And just for an anecdote that might be interesting to you, my wife is a teacher. She teaches grade 4 in the Toronto area. And out of curiosity, a couple months ago, I asked her as we were heading into 9/11, what's the school going to do? Because for the first time this year, she's teaching kids who weren't born when it happened. And I asked her, is there going to be any memorial? Will there be a mention during the announcements? And what she said to me was interesting. She started telling me her own opinion. She's smart enough to not get into political debates with me. But what she said was, all the teachers are really, really glad that this year 9/11 falls on a weekend, because we just don't like dealing with it. It's too awkward. It's too unpleasant. It raises difficult questions we don't want to get into, and we prefer to avoid it if we can. And a couple of months before that, a Canadian soldier in Afghanistan had been killed, who actually had very deep ties to the community my wife teaches in. And the local legion had asked the school, can we, maybe give a little speech at an assembly about our local boy who fell. And the school said no, because we don't want to answer difficult, awkward questions about why Canadian troops are in Afghanistan. It's a lot easier to do that sort of thing when it's a peacekeeping mission. It's hard when there's actual shooting on the ground. And it shouldn't be, because I think we have everything in our theoretical understanding of Western civilization to say that everyone in this room has freedom of conscience, of religion, of expression, and speech. But we also have national obligations that will sometimes put us in conflict with other countries which might have different values. I'm okay with that. I have nothing against saying that I believe Western values are superior. I like Western values. They've been good to me. But I don't know how many people, maybe even in this room, are comfortable with me saying that and asserting, I am very grateful that I was born by coincidence or gift of God, or however you want to look at it, in the West. It has been great for me. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I don't think I would enjoy the freedom and the quality of life that I would have here. But on the other hand, when I look at a lot of people, colleagues, friends, peers, acquaintances, very few people seem to have any understanding in the West of how lucky we have it, because the notion of freedom is flipped. And here I am getting a little political on you. I apologize for that. It's in my blood. Freedom isn't so much about having the right to do what you want anymore. It's become more about the freedom to have things done for you. The freedom to not worry about healthcare, education, security. That's a nice thing. It's a benefit. I'm very glad to have had that. But after a few generations of it, I think we've kind of lost the sense of obligation and civic duty that allowed us to build that. And that makes us culturally weak. And what would really be an interesting issue is, and this is a complete hypothetical, and I don't mean to suggest for an instant I believe this is possible. So if anyone's tweeting about this, put "if" in capitals, please. But if we ever were to find ourselves in a religious war against another power that was defined itself by religion, was fighting for religious means, how would we as Canadians or as Westerners fight that war? Would we be comfortable doing it? What linguistic and logical knots would we have to tie ourselves in to justify self-defense or even offensive operations? And I think when it comes to is peace possible and what should be done, if we're not self-confident in ourselves, if we don't have the ability to understand what we are and to believe that that is something worth defending, then I really don't know what we're going to do. And I actually am an optimist on this. I believe relativism has been bad. But something I find interesting is that polling has often shown that Canadians really, really value multiculturalism. But they value what they think multiculturalism is, and that isn't always the same thing. Polling done a couple of years ago said that Canadians really strongly believe the right of anyone from anywhere in the world, race, color, creed, sexual orientation, to come here and be Canadian. That's a good thing. The problem is we need to actually define what that means, and it's kind of the age-old question when it comes to Canadian identity, and maybe even Western identity, because we are pluralistic societies that are very accepting of difference, but we don't have to accept every difference. Every once in a while, it's okay to stand up and say, that is disgusting, that is wrong, and maybe we can't prevent it, maybe we can't stop it, but we don't need to do business with it. And just to close this up, because I know I'm a little bit over my 3 minutes, what that would mean to me economically, and this is kind of lame, and I know I'm going to sound like Jimmy Carter here, but it's energy independence. So long as we are stuck in corporate relationships with the Middle East that we rely on for our economic security, we're always going to have one foot in that pond, and I don't want to be there. I think this part of the world, the Middle East, has a lot of work to do sorting itself in, and I would have some thoughts about how they should go about doing it. I would also have predictions about how likely they would be to listen to me. But really, so long as we're tied up in it, we can't fully get out of it. This is more about the Americans than us. So, you know what? I like the oil sands. The oil sands are a way forward. We can maybe be masters of our own destiny. And I don't necessarily know that'll ever be developed. But so long as we're stuck doing business with the worst regimes in the Middle East, it's always going to be partially our problem. It would be much better for us, economically and politically, if we just didn't have to worry about it.
we agree on some of those points, and I want to amplify one or two of them. It's true that the threat to freedom of speech is fundamental, because as soon as we are prevented from having events like this, it's game over. And I think that relates to the other aspect that you raised, which is there a threat out there? Is it possible to have peace? Now, I think one point that hasn't come up, or at least not sufficiently clearly, I want to make now, the terrorist movements, the Islamic movements that we've been talking about, they don't just exist as organizations that are shadow and kind of underground. They have well-documented state sponsorship. And when we talk about Iran's role in the movement, it isn't a peripheral kind of bit part role. It is a significant multi-million-dollar role. When we talk about Saudi Arabia's role, it is in the billions of dollars. When we talk about Pakistan, we don't know how much money, but it's not so much money as military aid and its close incestuous relationship with the Pakistani military. All of those are significant to understanding what is at stake here. So I think actually of all the looming threats, we're going to see more of them, perhaps in Egypt with the rise of the Islamists, the power there. But the most significant one right now is Iran. Because Iran is the first and most self-aggrandizing Islamist regime. They're pursuing a nuclear program, and I'm not convinced that the US, and even more so, I'm not convinced the Israelis are in a position to, as you put it, vaporize that program, which is perhaps the way out. And the reason is, it had a lot to do with, we're not upholding our own values in the area of something like freedom of speech. Why do you think we would uphold it in the face of military threats? I mean, it's the same issue. If you don't believe that freedom of speech is a fundamental value that we should die for, why should anyone go to the battlefield to prevent an Islamist regime which seeks, among many other things, to silence everyone who does not toe the line with their dogma? I mean, there is no greater threat movement that hates free speech than the Islamist movement. What do they want? They want compliance. Do they tolerate heretics? No. Do they tolerate someone who leaves the religion, apostate? No. Do they tolerate infidels? You tell me. So the issue here is it's very much related. So I think the fundamental, as you raised it, bringing up the issue of free speech, is how do we regard our own values, individual rights, political freedom? And I think in terms of what is the essence of the West, it is a separation of church and state, a separation of state and economics, capitalism economically and politically, a society where each individual, regardless of their views and their creed and their sexual orientation and their age, each individual has the right to pursue their own goals in life while respecting the rights of others. That is the fundamental, as I see it. That is what we're fighting for. That is what they're after, to destroy and crush. And if people aren't exercised about the shenanigans of the UN and are not following it, and I'm pretty sure most people are not following it, because this has been going on for a couple of years now, this particular idea of censoring criticism of religion. There is really less hope in the sense that we're not going to go after Iran. I'm very skeptical that the US and even Israel, who has the most at stake, has the moral confidence. And that's really the issue we've been circling around, particularly in your comments just now. And what does that boil down to? It boils down to recognizing what we stand for as principles that are universally true, that are grounded in the world, that you cannot succeed unless you're free. You cannot succeed unless you have all the freedoms that we know are necessary. Recognizing that that's true and asserting that as our entitlement, our moral entitlement, our self-interest to defend that. That is part of what it means to have self-confidence, moral self-assertion. If we don't exercise it politically in the urbane precincts of the UN, where everyone wears a suit, only Arafat brought a weapon in, people regard that as a dignified forum. We're not standing up for ourselves. Are we going to do it in the face of a nuclear Iran? And whether they use a weapon or not, who knows exactly? Maybe it's just a bigger club they want to use in the region. Maybe it's just to threaten us. Whatever it is, Iran is the most active state sponsor of terrorism. It is the fountainhead of this movement in terms of its logistics and training and expertise. That is a mounting threat. What are we doing about it? Less than zero. And by less than zero, I mean actively supporting it, by appeasing it for the last 10 years, by not naming it as part of what it is, part of the enemy. We went to Iraq, we went to Afghanistan. Why? Leaving Iran to continue to grow and become more ferocious. It's gone into Afghanistan, it's gone into Iraq. Iraq is essentially a province of Iran politically. Iran is the big beneficiary of the last 10 years, and that is a mounting threat that we're not doing enough about. Why? Our moral ideas, the idea that we aren't in a position to assert our own values, that is crippling us. It's time to change that.
Final question, we'll start with you. The final question is, do you see any trends or care to project the future in relation between the West and Islam?
In 3 minutes. I guess the easy answer is no, and I'll pass the buck. That's the heavy lifting. I think the big trend has already come to the surface, which is, if you put it side by side, there's a movement that is gaining a foothold, more than a foothold. It's ascending to power. The Islamist movement, which has a state sponsor, a whole clique of state sponsors. And it's rising politically. We know what its goals are. We haven't identified it properly as part of the threat. And what's significant about them is true. They're not militarily or even materially significantly threatening, except for the nuclear program, which is a big deal. They don't have the military to come after us. But our default, our failing to stand up to them, is a huge encouragement. So they're materially weak, but they're morally strong in the sense of believing they're right, and believing and asserting that they're right. I mean, it's astounding if you listen to some of these Iranian leaders, or some of the Saudi clerics. They spout off so regularly that we'll be swimming in, the West will be swimming in rivers of fire and so forth. They're not bowed or cowed or intimidated by the fact that the US has 150,000 troops on their border, or until recently did, in Iraq. They're not afraid. That is the kind of moral confidence that we should be concerned about. They're materially weak, but assertive morally. We're materially strong, but weak morally in the sense that we don't assert our values. We don't even recognize them and know how to defend them properly. That is a significant problem, long term. I mean, they're on the rise by our default. And we're letting that happen.
You know, I would have been much more comfortable confidently predicting a trend 18 months ago because I wouldn't have been proven so badly wrong. I freely admit, I don't think I'm really alone on this. I didn't see the Arab Spring coming. That one caught me by surprise, and I think every once in a while you need to admit you can't see everything. I genuinely don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East, and it's something I think about. I have friends in the region. It's, it's personal to me. It's also professional. I don't know what's going to happen in the next few months about the Iranian nuclear program. I don't know what's going to happen with this new governing agreement that they're trying to hammer out between Fatah and Hamas and these Israel-occupied territories. I genuinely don't know if the Egyptian people will trade one dictator for another. Looks like they will, but they took one out, they can do it again. I'm more interested in what we're doing here and the trends I see in the West, because I think that's relevant. I think whether or not we've admitted it, we have essentially given up, and I mean this very collectively in the West, not specifically in Canada, but I think we've essentially given up the idea that we can be the world's policeman. I think the failure to win, whatever that would mean in Afghanistan, I think we might continue to maybe do occasional interventions like we did in Libya and might still in Syria, but I do think the trend is that, frankly, we are out of money. And the generation ahead will be one of having to pay our own bills and settle the accounts we've already committed to pay with an aging population. That's true of America, it's true of us, it's certainly true of the Europeans. This is really going to limit our ability to respond, except in any event other than overt defense. I don't think today the United States could afford to launch a war like Iraq unless they had a really, really good reason to go in and maybe the public would support it. And you know, maybe that isn't the worst thing, because like I said, I believe in disengagement as being the smart thing to do for now. But what I also worry about in the West is how difficult it's become to answer these questions. What are we going to do about the Iranian nuclear program? What are we going to do about Afghanistan? What were we going to do about Iraq while Western forces were still there in a big way? Because they've just been absorbed by what I would call an increasingly dysfunctional domestic political environment, where, you know, issues like Iran and Afghanistan and the fate of the Middle East, it shouldn't be partisan politics. The political leadership of the Western countries should at least know what their own national interests are, but I don't think they do. And that is something that worries me, but maybe, and this is maybe me reaching and being a bit naive here, but I'm trying to be an optimist. Maybe especially as the United States reduces its military budget in the years ahead and really does have to give up some capability, it will make better choices with what it has left. And maybe that will result in a more determination to fight defensive wars or use drones in a particular way. When it comes to where do I necessarily see the West and Islam coexisting in the next 10, 20 years, I tend to be a believer that history generally unfolds in more or less the same way it has before. So I don't necessarily foresee something cataclysmic happening, but I also don't necessarily see new peace dawning in a brave new era. I imagine many of the problems we have today will be the problems we have 20 years from now. If there are things that will fix these problems, it will be social or technological developments we can't foresee. The exception to this, and it must be said, is Israel. Because Israel is a bastion of the Western world in the Middle East. And unlike us, over here in North America and Western Europe, we have inertia, we have mass, we have economic strength. Israel is vulnerable. And I'm not necessarily sure I would care to bet on Israel's long-term viability. They are dependent in large measure on Western strength and backing. I don't know if the West has the willingness or even the means to continue that. I'll just end with this. A few years ago, one of my closest friends is dual Israeli-Canadian citizen. He has served in the Israeli military. He was wounded in action. Grew up with me in Toronto. And a couple of years ago, he basically flew back for a couple of weeks. He stayed with me. And I asked him, it was an unexpected visit. I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "I just want to make sure all my paperwork is in order in case I ever need to get on a plane, get out of Israel, and show up in some other country as a Canadian again." And that worried me, but I couldn't necessarily tell him he was wrong to do it. I don't know if we have the strength here to look out for our friends. I'm hopeful we might have enough strength to look out for ourselves. And if it's going to be that, it's going to have to come on 5, 6, maybe 10 items down, a very long laundry list of more basic, but I would say less fundamental problems. How are we going to pay for our health care? How are we going to pay for education? How are we going to pay for retirement? Those are the issues I worry we're going to be distracted by for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I wonder when we're ready again to actually lift up our eyes and look out at the world, how much will it change since we stopped paying attention? That is, if anything, what would keep me up at night. Because I would certainly say, although I'm not a defeatist on the Western prospects, we're going to have to get used to sharing the world with other powers, and I hope they play nicely with us, because we don't play meanly enough to win.
Well, I'd like to address myself to our students today. I see in the audience a lot of our students here. I want to address my to my students. On the short and medium term, I am regrettably, like Matt, somewhat of a pessimist. But in long term, I'm a tremendously optimistic person. My daughter is about 7 years old, so the same age as your wife would be doing it. 9/11 means nothing to her. The world is an oyster, she's a pearl, and I hope she will just grow beautifully. And so I look forward, when looking back, at the beginning of the 20th century, the long peace, the classical liberal age crashed. Nobody anticipated it. Nobody saw it coming. And it crashed in a huge, monstrous way. When we look back from our vantage point today, the two world wars can be telescoped into one. And so that peace of the 19th century, that immense expansion of the 19th century, all came dramatically to an end. And people who lived through that lived through hell. And people who have studied that through the 20th century and now know what hell it was. But lo and behold, what is Europe today with all its problems? Little Belgium, analogous to little Israel, was the ground, meaning the point. The battlefield between Germany and France crushed. Well, it is the center now of the new Europe that is widening. It is where the headquarters are of the European Union, of the NATO, Brussels, Belgium. The world in 1914, the Europeans could not have imagined what it would be at the end of the 20th century. Cold War over, Europe united, and a new world possibility. I see that's what's happening in the Arab Muslim world. If you want to understand what Europe went through, not only in the 20th century, but in the great transformation of Europe from the pre-modern to the modern age, it was one heck of a conflict. It was one massive bloodletting that went on. Revolution, counter-revolution, beheading of royalties, reigns of terror. And out of that emerged the wonderful new world. The wonderful in the sense that you and I share it, understand it, we want to treasure it, we want to keep it safe, we want it to grow. It came out of a terribly difficult situation and circumstances of wars and conflict and revolution. To understand that history, because that history is past, you've got to look at the Arab Muslim world. That's exactly what is going on. And out of this will emerge the Arab Muslim world. We don't know in what precise shape, but it will be a different world, a world more or less reconciled with itself. And there, my optimism is like Brussels or like Belgium. And as a Muslim, I look at it and I'm projecting it to when my daughter will be my age, coming towards the end of the 21st century, when her little children will be running around. That it will be Israel that will have taught the Arab world how to reconcile itself with modernity. It was England that was less than 10 million people that went out and made the greatest empire in world history. An empire, the British Empire, upon which the sun never sank. And the crown jewel of the empire was India. Several hundred million people. Can you imagine a country with just about a population, maybe in the Golden Horseshoe region, with the world's largest empire, and the crown jewel is India? 200 years of British rule made India what India today is. The world's largest functioning democracy. Now the Indians are going and investing money in Britain, and the British are hungry for Indian investment. Okay? That's the trade-off. Those are the changes that take place. We get so preoccupied with the immediacy of the problem that we do not see the large picture. Speaking as a Muslim, speaking as Anwar Sadat spoke at the Knesset, most of us who do believe that there is a higher power, after 2 millennia, the resurrection of the Jewish state in the land which had been Judea and Samaria, with the land and the people that built Jerusalem, with the Arabs and Muslims see it the third holiest city, but it is the holiest city of the Jews. And they are the people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab. And that's what Sadat, as a Muslim, was speaking to and sharing bread and breaking bread with his brothers and sisters in Jerusalem in 1977. There is a higher purpose. Just as the pagan Arabs learned to abandon the worshipping of stones by turning to the worship of the God of Abraham, Israel is there to teach the Arabs to come to terms with the modern world. There is a higher purpose, and that will happen, God willing, inshallah.